welcome to our episode club. Today we are going to be talking about sort of lower subdimensional worlds. And hi, Uncle Bill. In Futurama and in the Orville. Now the interesting thing is that they tend to actually visit. Once I watched these episodes, I mean, I'd seen them before, but once I watched them again, I realized that, like, they actually don't visit the 2D worlds until the third act in both series, both shows. Futurama and Orville, neither of them go to Flatland, their version of Flatland beforehand. But I want this, because it's like, you know, it's Futurama and the Orville, so we're not talking deep science here, but I would love for this to be a discussion about, like, the philosophy and the science and all of that between hyperdimensional species, because some of the episodes are really, really good at talking about the sort of more philosophical implications of it, and it's still pretty cool, and I like the way that they do it. Oh, thank you, Adam! How generous! Yay! And welcome, Uncle Bill. Now, what we are going to do, we'll talk about Futurama first, and then we'll talk about the Orville, but the plots are pretty similar. But if you haven't seen one versus the other, you can pick and choose what you like. But that's okay. About Futurama, there's some deep science cuts. We've done a few episodes on Futurama here, and they'll throw out phrases. So they had physicists and mathematicians, and thank you for the follow, Book Addict. I don't know why the notification didn't go through, but thank you. I saw it pop up here. They have physicists and mathematicians, and it shows, and they have some references, one-line dialogue stuff that is just deep cuts in science that are great. Right. The world of the mitochondria. I love that. That's really funny, Blue Booger. I love your username, and I have no problem saying it out loud, other than, like, I just physically can't say it out loud. But I love it. Especially because one of the panels that we recorded this weekend was a Star Trek versus Star Wars science tag team showdown, and you can better believe midichlorians came into the conversation there. So good times. The mitochondria are the powerhouse of the cell, as we all know. All right, so the Futurama episode that we're going to talk about is 2D Blacktop. Deep references. I mean, they come fast and furious in this, for sure. It's impressive. So it also has one of my favorite jokes that I actually wrote down the whole joke because it was so funny, for me. This will tell you a little bit about my personality, my humor. Essentially, the professor's working on the Planet Express ship, and they all kind of come over, and he's like, all right, I just turbocharged the matter compressor. And Fry goes, what's the matter compressor? And the professor goes, well, nothing now that I've charged the matter compressor. It's brilliant. Brilliant. I love the humor here. You know, the show, this is in its 10th season. This is the first episode of the 10th season, if you're, depending on how you count them with the movies and everything else like that. But it's the first episode of the final season. And they pack in a lot of jokes in this one, and it still warms my geeky little heart. They do, planetary, yay, thank you. They do, basically what happens is, the plot of this is that no worries. The professor's decided he wants to get into racing, as one does. Supercharges the matter compressor, as we learned, and he, essentially, like, it becomes like a Fast and Furious parody type thing with a ton of sci-fi references. he starts basically, he turns it from a tepid rod into a hot rod is the joke. Has to break into the waste, the dumpster area. Dumpster area? Whatever it is. Wherever the junkyard. Has to break into the junkyard. Another great, hilarious scene when he has a chainsaw that he's like about to dig through the chain link fence, and then he gets it in there and the spikes just carry him up and over because his weight ratio compared to the tension of the springs of the chain link fence is something I thought about and would make sense. Yeah, no worries, Andy. Like I said, it's the how they divide up the episodes is a mess. But anyway, so there's a couple funny things here. First of all, is that when he goes to do the hot rod racing, they have a Mobius drag strip, and they essentially, it's a Mobius strip, and they have a great line about, they're really pulling out the topology there, and the 2 laps is actually 1 full. Yeah, 2 laps is 1 lap. They've only completed half a lap. Well, on a Mobius strip, 2 laps is 1 lap. And it's pretty great. And a side plot that I want to talk about before we get into the 2D Flatland world is Leela basically gets a super safe van spaceship that has no windows, that is all plushy on the inside, that is full on with seatbelts. You can't do anything in it. And they have to take a package to Glorianimus 3, which orbits a rainbow giant star. And it's this spectacular vista of space wonderness. And then they zoom in inside of the spaceship and they're just watching a dot approach another dot, which was really funny. And I would be remiss if I didn't say that rainbow giant stars are not a thing. We'll just make that perfectly clear. But it's really pretty in a cartoon episode. Yeah, Brad, the cup holders are great. The whole ship. I like the squishy view screen. That was my favorite part, but it was hilarious. So they're essentially, it's one big, hilarious, oh, thank you, Deep Astronomy. And I suppose you're right, you can still make rainbows out of them. I guess. We could divide the whole, it would have to basically emit, alright, this is our job, this is what we do. They said they have a rainbow giant star. How would a rainbow giant star work? You would have to have a star that basically prisms itself such that the viewer would see multiple components of the electromagnetic spectrum simultaneously. As opposed to... Fair enough, Rouge. Oh, awesome. So, we talked in our Astronomy 101 class about the spectrum of objects in our universe. And how a star will have a continuous spectra with absorption and emission lines based on the composition of the star, right? So, and the color of the star we see corresponds to its temperature, and its temperature is its peak in the electromagnetic spectrum. So our star peaks around the yellow to green barrier. So we see our star through filters as yellowish. Colder stars will peak in a slightly lower part of the electromagnetic spectrum, so they will appear red. Brighter stars, hotter stars will peak in the higher part of it at hotter temperatures, which is more in the blue range. And I'm giggling because I can't believe I'm actually trying to teach this in the context of Futurama discussing a rainbow giant star and why that wouldn't be possible. So as Andy mentioned, Super DTG, you can make rainbows out of them because they are a continuous spectrum. So maybe technically we could say that all stars are rainbow stars. We just see one part of the spectrum. And if your view screen was able to filter them, then it would be a rainbow star. I can't justify any more than that. But maybe we learned something here? Maybe? Still fun to think about. We love it. Um, I can't believe I even tried explaining that, but that's what we do here. So they're driving on their Mobius strip, their Mobius drag strip, and they basically collide. And then when they collide, they flatten. And the explanation is that we collided at relativistic speeds, which collapsed us into 2 dimensions. Sure. And but then they go to this 2-dimensional world, and they literally call out, like, Flatland. Oh, thanks, Mikhail, and thank you for being here. They literally say, like, Flatland, which is an old sci-fi short story, I think from the 1880s. Is it that old? I think it is. For an episode club about Flatland, I should have written down when Flatland was published and who wrote it. So if anyone is feeling particularly googly, feel free to throw that information in the chat and accept my apologies that I did not come prepared enough to talk about the original Flatland. But they straight up reference it, quite obviously. So there are some really funny scenes here once they are in Flatland. Thank you, Rouge. 1884. Awesome. Edwin Abbott. Thank you, Billy. Excellent. One of the oldest books I've ever read. Fair enough. I'm a big fan of classic literature, so I can't say it's the oldest, but that's still a pretty good one. So, 1884. And the premise in Flatland, as explained in the Orville episode about this, where he literally is like, Flatland is about... it's an allegory for society, talking about how it's a 2-dimensional universe, and the higher number of sort of corners and points that you have, the higher class you are in society. And they divide up men, women, workers, gentry, like all that sort of thing, proletariat, bourgeoisie, around that time. And the circles are like super gods because they have like an infinite number of points. Or corners, whatever that is. Sorry, I'm clearly having a good day, but I appreciate all of you sticking with me here. And then, yeah, like, so you have like lines and then squares and polygons. As the polygons increase, that's the word, they start to have higher and higher sort of ranks in their society. And yeah, Uncle Bill, same. It's like there's so many references to it, and that we managed to have 2 sci-fi comedy episodes have Flatland episodes is pretty fabulous. So I appreciate everyone who suggested these, because I love it. One of the funniest scenes is once they establish, so Fry basically walks off the ship and he's like, oh man, I'm like a stupid cartoon character, which is hilarious. And then the professor explains, like, this is like Flatland, and different laws of physics may apply here. Like if I drop this marble, and then the marble goes tunk, 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 tunk. Okay, well that was the same. A lot of this is just going to be me giggling about all these jokes in these episodes. But they can't physically walk past each other. They have to go up and over each other. And I think even, especially for cartoon animators, this must have been hard, because they are able to visualize in the 3 dimensions. And even though their cartoons are 2-dimensional, being able to actually like draw how they walk past each other is pretty impressive. So they literally are just static, 2-dimensional, and they have to go around each other like this to try to interact. Because Professor says, okay, well, if you look at this egg here, and anytime, I think they flash to perspective like twice, you just see the line. But he says, if you see here, if you could look down, which we as the viewer in the 4th, technically 3rd dimension here are doing, you would see a bird inside this egg. And just as a 4-dimensional being would be able to see a chick inside a 3D egg. I love that. I love that, because right there, it's dumb, but it philosophically, your brain is like, whoa. Because you realize that as the viewer, you're looking down in the 3rd dimension, and they're interacting in the 2 dimensions. So for the way that Futurama visualizes this episode and portrays it is brilliant. it's brilliant. This is why Futurama, as a sci-fi astronomy nerd, I full endorse. I had an astronomy professor who I was asked for a research job with, and he basically was like, I'll give you the job, but only contingent upon you watching Futurama, which is kind of, it was a joke, but like, that's how deep the cuts are for some of their comedy. But I do like, yeah, so essentially what it is it shows, because it shows their perspective, right? So when they look this way, all they see is a line. And they kind of joke about that a little bit, that they can like hear each other. And then they move past by going up and over. And then the professor says exactly what Andy said in there. If you were able to look down, which you can't because we can only look left, you know, in our 2-dimension. If you could look down, you would see the chicken in there, which is exactly what we as the viewers in the 3rd dimension are able to see. And then that's what hurts your brain. And this is where I'd love, like, feel free to throw your own thoughts in here, because it's more of like a philosophical discussion than anything. But this reference to there being a 4-dimensional species, when we have chickens and we can't see inside the egg to see what's inside there, the way the professor describes it is that a 4-dimensional species would be able to see into this. Now, we're not saying the 4th dimension being time. We mean 4 spatial dimensions would be able to see inside of a 3D egg. And that's so hard for us to wrap our brains around. But when the professor explains it with the chick inside the egg, and the fact that they can't see it, as Andy said, because the line is blocking their line of sight, we can see it because we're looking down this way. I don't know. For me, that's a great way to wrap your mind around it. And it kind of works, and I kind of like it. Fair enough, comedy. X-ray glasses work too. That's looking in the different part of the spectrum, not in a different dimension. Just so we're making that perfectly clear. But I appreciate that. So yeah, like, you're the artist looking physically down on their paper, Brad. Exactly. That's the mind-bendy part, is especially because, and I think the reason this works so well in Futurama is because it's an animated show. It's a cartoon. And so you suddenly have that reality of it being a flat dimensional show that they are heavily restricting themselves to in this scenario. But as the artist looking down on the paper, I mean, that's some Monty Python crap right there. That's like, when one may imbibe in such things that may feel like you've been transported to another dimension, that's that, well, but who's the artist outside of our own dimension, man? As I may or may not have had an experience like that one kind, but I plead the fifth. Anyway, so Andy, story time. When I got to multivariable calculus in college, my professor told me I'd done so well in mathematics because I was able to intuit the math. He said I wouldn't be able to do it in this class. He was right. I had to work a lot harder because my brain couldn't wrap around it. That's funny. I mean, that's fair. And for me, I had a similar experience, except mine was with the imaginary variables. So I took analysis, not complex analysis. I took regular analysis as a math major. I did a math degree and a physics degree. As a math major, I did analysis and I loved it and it was fascinating. And so the next semester I was looking for classes to sign up for it, and they had a complex analysis class. And I was like, okay, complex. That sounds like the next level. So let's take complex analysis. And it wasn't until the week before the class started, when I went to pick up my textbook, I realized complex meant complex numbers, meaning imaginary numbers, something I had never been good at, ever. And it was like I was sick that day in junior high when we learned about imaginary numbers, and I never wrapped my brain around them. All I knew, like, and how to play with them. I just always... It was hard for me to wrap my head around imaginary numbers. But I stuck with the class, and then I went in, and the professor explained imaginary numbers thusly. And I promise this isn't going to turn into a complex analysis class, but similarly, with the trying to wrap your head around dimensions, the way the professor explained imaginary numbers was saying that, all right, because this is mirrored, I'll try to do this right, but imagine a real number being a matrix, a 2x2 matrix, and in the primary locations, so your 1, 1 and your 2, 2 locations, that number, that's your real number. So if you're talking about the number 2, or 30, or pi, or whatever, you're going to have 2 and 2, and 0 and 0. In imaginary numbers, the numbers are here. So it's like another plane of dimensions. And that was when I was like, oh, I get it. I get the complex plane. I get the imaginary plane. And just for me, being able to visualize numbers in a higher dimension made understanding imaginary numbers much easier for me. Because matrices I was fine with, and I could understand those, and I understood how to manipulate matrices. So when we started comparing real numbers and imaginary as thinking of them being hyperdimensional, see, I promised this anecdote was relevant to our discussion. I was able to understand them a lot better, and frankly, complex analysis ended up being my favorite class that I ever took because my mind was blown, and it was amazing. And yeah, anyway, people are sharing their math class stories. It's no joke. And when you get up into higher dimensions, sometimes it clicks, sometimes it doesn't. And for me, it was something that clicked working in higher dimensions there. But so all of this we were talking about, I'll try to kind of recap because tangents are welcome in this discussion about hyperdimensional realities. This idea of, oh, thank you, Trower Durst, I appreciate it. As looking down at the artist's paper in the same way that we are looking on the screen in Futurama and see the egg inside, and they're like, we can't see it because in 3D you'd be able to see it, but in 2D we can't, is a good analogy for how a four-dimensional species, spatially four-dimensional species, would be able to see in 3 dimensions. Similarly to the oh my god, I wanted to say tardigrade, not tardigrade. What powers the TARDIS, and also what is a 4-dimensional cube? And we're gonna play trivia class right now. What's a 4-dimensional cube? What was one of the, this is all the same thing that I can't remember the name of. Tesseract. Andy wins a prize. All right, we gotta start. I'm starting to figure out like rewards and all of this stuff, so I'll figure out something when we do this stuff. But yes, Tesseract. Similarly, a Tesseract is a 4-dimensional cube. So if you have a line, then you go to a square, then you go to a cube, then you go to a Tesseract. And Tesseracts pop up in science fiction all the time, usually treating that 4th dimension as time, which is why we see it in the Infinity Stone and in the TARDIS. But if you think about a Tesseract is really just a 4-dimensional cube. And there are some great things on... yeah. There's definitely some great visuals of like rotating and projecting a Tesseract such that you can kind of perceive it in 3 dimensions, but it's super, super hard. So yeah, it's interesting and I like it. Another cool thing, so in this episode that I loved how rigidly they were able to stick to their 2-dimensional rules. When they meet the lords of Flatbush, which again is another reference, the lords of Flatbush bring them to the castle, and the drawbridge goes down, and there's a chain linking, and they're approaching this way. And I was like, and then the chain did that, and then they walked past. And I was like, yeah. So they were animation completely consistent there. Ooh, Eye of Harmony. Thank you. I like the way, just all of the animation picking up. All I mean is that they were very consistent with the 2 dimension. They had a great discussion on how the digestive system doesn't function in the 2-dimensional space. And we'll talk about this in the Orville too, how they explain how their own reality doesn't line up with this. But they, yeah, exactly. but they were able, he basically said, we have a two-ended digestive system. And they show sort of the old, human body digestive system. And he's like, look, you can divide the person in 2D with this. And, and so our digestive system doesn't work. And then, of course, they ask the Lords of Flatbush how you're able to eat and digest things, and he just wraps his thing around and then sends it in his head into a bubble, and then that bubble disintegrates, and then he spits it out the other side. So they were able to make it work. But our digestive system, being two-ended, makes us not able to exist in the Lords of Flatbush 2D world of Futurama. So one of the comedy things that they're doing in this episode is this idea of dimensional drift, that when the professor's trying to evade the cops, or as he got the popo, he is running down and then pulls the lever and then slides into technically the fourth dimension and then pops back out. And so their idea for how to get back into normal space is to essentially speed up to dimensional escape velocity, which is a smart sounding, completely made up concept that would allow you to then go into the third dimension. So they speed up, they start to drift, they start to do their dimensional drift, and then they do a fun like warp factor, like dimension 2.2, 2.3, and then Fry's like, I see some up. And then the ship pops out the other side. And we don't need to go into any more detail than that. But the way this Flatland in Futurama works, and I would say they're probably... The highlight for me is the egg explanation, and how three-dimensional beings view their two-dimensional worlds and what the limitations are, as an analogy to a four-dimensional being looking at a three-dimensional world. How we're not able to eat in a 2D world the way that was artistically designed made sense. And yeah, I love this episode. Oh, and then the marble joke, that still cracked me up. There's different laws of physics here. Okay, well that was the same. But yeah, so they did a great way of doing it here, Sansombra. I agree. The dimensional velocity term is brilliant. It's fabulous. So I've decided we're going to implement a thing in this Dr. Aaron's Astrometrics Lab episode club. When we don't do a Star Trek episode, we're going to play Spot the Star Trek. And it's going to happen between episodes, and we will play Spot the Star Trek. Because last week, when we did Stargate SG-1, remember, he claimed that he played Captain Kirk, or that his name was Captain Kirk, and we said that was their only mistake in the episode. I mean, the self-consistency and the time travel and everything was okay, but that he played Kirk, and they were in 1969, they would have known Kirk was a thing. Anyway, that one, Spot the Star Trek, last week before I made it a thing. This week, playing Spot the Star Trek, we found it in the Futurama episode, because in the Futurama episode, when the professor goes to the junkyard, you see the USS Enterprise sitting in the pile of rubble. It is one of the discarded spaceships in the junkyard. So we have successfully spotted the Star Trek, and we will make this a thing in the future. You're welcome. Because Star Trek is that pervasive in science fiction. So we'll play this every time, and if there's not an explicit Star Trek reference, this is again, if we're not doing a Star Trek episode that week, if there's not an explicit reference, then we have to play the 6 Degrees of Star Trek and try to get it to Star Trek, either based on the actors or the writers or the plot. And I have a feeling we will be able to play this game just fine. So brace yourself for this. I will be posting the poll for next week. We had some close ones to this, so one. So I think I'll probably repost some of the runners-up from the last couple weeks, and we'll vote between those. That's for the patrons, so if you want to check out the patron link, you can check that out down below to take part in voting for what becomes the episode club. And while we're mentioning that, I also added it as a reward here on Twitch. So if you want to cash in channel points, I have set it to, I think, 500. we're testing this out. It may change in the future, but if you want to have a one-off shot at suggesting a movie or a sci-fi episode for us to discuss, you can redeem your channel points for that. So with that, that was our intermission. and we played Spot the Star Trek. Thank you. This is what we do. All right, so next up we're going to talk about Orville. The Orville New Dimensions episode. This was a good episode. I have up and down feelings about the Orville. We don't have to get into Orville versus Star Trek or any of that. I obviously appreciate sci-fi comedy as much as the next person. Some of their plot lines sometimes are Star Trek episodes, but that's okay. Most science fiction has pretty deep references, so I appreciate that. And it's funny. There are some characters in the Orville that I absolutely love. And I forgot to pull up character names in the Orville because we know that I have to watch something at least 5 times before I embed character names into my brain. But overall, this episode I remembered because the whole 2D Flatland aspect I thought was really, really good. So I was excited. I think this was Super DTG's recommendation to watch this one. But I like this one a lot. Okay, so let me pull this up. And I got my notes. All right. So, all right. Pull those up. Ooh, geez. Okay, we'll just leave that there. That's fine. Sorry, I'm pulling up characters on my other screen that I can't see through my microphone. We've all been there. Okay, so again, this is another one where they don't actually go to Flatland until like the 3rd arc, which is fine. Now, the funny thing about Orville is it may have been a while ago, and it may not have been you, so I'm not sure. But we collectively as a group voted for it, so it works. So this is season 1, episode 11 of the Orville, and I would like to do some more Orville episodes because I remember when they first, yeah, agreed, Uncle Bill, exactly. Like the homage to old science fiction is pervasive throughout, so I completely agree on that. But the way I remember they describe the quantum drive in the Orville isn't done in this episode, but I think it wasn't terrible. It's essentially warp drive, but they play with quantum physics in a slightly different way. So essentially they're flying along. Yeah, if they need a science advisor, I mean, I would be a science advisor, but I feel like they very consciously and jokingly throw the word quantum in front of everything as their technobabble. And that's like their running joke. I respect that. Now, if they want a science advisor to do that, I can certainly do that. but I respect their ongoing quantum jokes in here. So their faster than light engine is basically a quantum drive, and we don't have to get in the details because it wasn't really described in this episode, but it pulls them out of its warp, but it pulls them out, and the question is, did we hit a squirrel? They basically skimmed the outer edge of a spatial anomaly and ripped the quantum engine out of alignment. Okay. The spatial anomaly that they skimmed past, they use the comparison, nice squirrel, perfect, that it's just a pothole. I love that. When it comes to spatial anomalies screwing up space travel, just being like, yeah, it was a space-time pothole, kind of works for me. I'm all right with that. I thought that was really, really funny. They measure a residual quantum wake on the side of the ship that skimmed it, and they see that all these plants have died in the ship. They meet a Horbalak, the species, and the Horbalak, basically, they kind of have a little confrontation, and then they go through this anomaly. They seem to flatten and then appear on a slight distance away. And when they go to investigate this, the Horbalak, in my notes I put, is super dead. As Dalen had the great suggestion, so would be interested to have a spaceship that altered the entire ship's de Broglie wavelength and just set the ship's location to another location in the universe. That's cool. I like that idea. It basically like diffracted the ship through the universe. That's pretty awesome. It would have to, but that's the spatial anomaly. I like that. That's a really good insight. Thank you for sharing that. So they basically, they don't get as intricate as commenting on the de Broglie wavelength of the ship. They just say that this is a doorway. This is basically an aperture into a lower dimensional region of space. And the interesting thing, and that Claire, the doctor, the woman from Deep Space Nine, thank you, Billy. The quantum phasing signature of the anomaly does not conform to a universal constant, and the anomaly is a doorway. Billy's our resident quote person, so I don't have to write down all these quotes as we go. But that it's basically how I did actually write partial quotes here, where they talk about the field stability when they're trying to figure out how to fix the engine. So Billy, if you want to go hunting for that, feel free to go for it. Yeah, Dr. Finn, Claire Finn. The interesting thing, so we had the conversation in Futurama about why they wouldn't be able to survive, and that's because they were all written like that, and the digestive system is two-dimensional, and so if they actually had one, it would split them in half. The reason they don't survive, and the Horrible-Act does not survive passing through this anomaly, is because Dr. Finn explains that proteins have 3D geometries on them, and the way they interact with the cells in our body is through that three-dimensional geometries, which is true. And so if you flatten out and then pop back up, that still has to be all perfectly aligned, and that's hard to do, likely impossible that you would be able to retain all of those geometries in such a way that they would interact the appropriate way. Oh, is that the definition of the quantum drive? Yeah. I mean, it's warp drive, the Alcubierre drive. So in the chat, we have the Union's quantum drive technology is a realized form of an Alcubierre warp drive, which compresses in the front, expands in the back, creating folds in the fabric that a ship simply flies through. That's warp drive. It's the same thing, but they just don't call it warp because they're trying not to get busted by CBS for licensing reasons. So their solution to get through this is that this Horrible-Act essentially has a bunch of smuggled weapons on the ship. Yeah. They have a bunch of smuggled weapons on the ship. They're like, we're going to get busted if we get found with all of these things, so we need to go hide. And the idea is that they can build a quantum bubble, use it so the engine is out, but the field generator still works. Yeah, because we have Jupiter's worth of negative mass lying around. Exactly. And they can still, even though the engine can't build the warp drive, the field generator is still working. And so they can enter this anomaly, build a warp bubble around the ship, and protect them from two-dimensional space. We're going to break down all of this. So the field stability, they get into the technobabble of how to do this. They're trying to increase the field stability of this engine. It's coupled with the quantum phase inducers, and they need to match the deflector amplitude of the quantum wave function in order to compensate. Whew. That's a lot of technobabble. That's not bad, but it's a lot of technobabble. Again, they've used quantum at least 3 times, at least twice that I wrote down, but I'm pretty sure at least 3 times in that conversation. The quantum phase inducers, the quantum wave function, and then the quantum field stability. They're just throwing quantum in there, which is okay, it's a comedy science fiction. Don't get me wrong. I'm not going to berate any of this for that, because I think that that's hilarious and I have no problem with it. So they have a really funny conversation, and the quantum drive, yeah, exactly. They have a really funny conversation about the same thing that Futurama did with the chicken and the egg. And as Daily, I'm going to read this out loud. The quantum is quantizing the quantitative quanta. Exactly. And even then, I think he used quantum pretty accurately through most of that, which is impressive. I like it. But they have a really funny conversation where, Gordon is like, so they enter in there, they see this whole two-dimensional civilization. Their ship is still in 3D because they're protected, in theory, by this quantum field bubble that they have. They see this whole civilization. They're like, get notes. This is bonkers. This is impressive. But they wouldn't necessarily know we're here because they exist in the two dimensions. And then Gordon is like, well, but does that mean that there's a 4-dimensional species that's watching us? And how often do they watch us? And could they see under the covers? Which is funny. It's a dumb joke, but it's a funny joke. I respect that. But it's back to this philosophical discussion, right? We talk about like simulated multiverse theories, this idea that we're all a simulation, the whole Matrix concept, right? That we're being observed by creators who have made this experiment, and we're just living out these lives and being observed constantly. Now, the hyperdimensional question doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be a simulated universe. It just wonders how many other dimensions there could be out there, and if there are species that could exist in higher dimensions. Star Trek has done that a little bit too. Species 8472 they come from fluidic space, which really the way they talk about it is subspace. And even subspace is technically like a hyperdimensional species. They're able to jump in and out of normal space. Remember, subspace lives outside of our sheet, outside of our trampoline. And so that if you have a species that's able to go in and out of subspace freely, that kind of works, that they're hyperdimensional. And so that was what I knew. I was writing down my future sub emotes once we unlock them, and I was like, I feel like I'm missing one. I was missing a bowling ball and trampoline drink reference. So, drinking game emote. Yeah. For those of you who might be new here, I, being a astrophysicist in general relativity, I use the bowling ball and the trampoline to explain general relativity all the time. And anytime I reference it, that's become a drinking game for anyone who wants to take part. It's not mandatory, but we'll turn that into an emote. I already have a cheers emote, but I feel like we have to do this as a separate one. Anyway, this whole idea, there you go, Char. I appreciate that. Their quantum bubble starts to overload. The power flow is starting to I mean, that's why it started. Yeah. We don't have to go into any more than that. The ship, actually, they do a cool thing, right? So this quantum bubble is struggling to maintain its stability. It's basically being overloaded. And it deteriorates briefly, and the ship starts to do that. And then it pops back up as they restore it. And they very briefly, like, kind of skim through that. Yeah, it is. Absolutely how everyone gets their ideas. That's the one I was talking about, Uncle Bill. Thank you. That's my cheers. That's my cheers one. So I want to have a good toast, but we do need more of a drinking game one. They realize that the anomaly closes up, so they can't return. Then they are realizing that due to inverse polarization of the quantum bubble, they're being pulled towards this species, and the engines are dying. I think that was right. Or did the inverse polarization, was that their solution to get out of it? I didn't write down enough information about it. But basically their solution is that they're going to go in the shuttle. The big ship's engines have dead. They're overloaded. They've run out of power. They can't sustain their bubble anymore. Their hyperdimensional bubble. So in order to get out of it, they're going to get in the shuttle. Shuttle will use a tractor beam, and they will basically tow the ship out of there. Oh yeah, that was it. So the inverse polarization of the quantum bubble is pulling us towards the civilization. That was the bad thing that was happening. Polarization of quantum fields. That's a tricky one. So quantum field theory doesn't... I love that science emote. I love that one. Quantum field theory basically has polarizations. I gotta remember. I relearned a bunch of quantum field theory recently for something else, and I'm trying to recall how it handles polarizations, because it's this idea that you have fermions and leptons, and you guys all have great science emojis, and the polarization is inherent to those particles, those 0-point energy particles. And so polarization could be inherent there, but I don't know if that entirely works. I like that for science one. Yeah, and it looks like Tron. Thank you. I appreciate that. I appreciate the conversation there. Yeah, 0-point something. Yeah. Anyway, they see this aperture up ahead of them, and they're basically going to tow the Orville out. They create a bubble in the shuttle, and then it starts to go out. And then when they are... This is funny. When they're explaining it, they're like, okay, so we're going to make a 3D bubble within the shuttle itself to protect us as we're going through. And they say, so it's going to be a higher dimension on the inside. And they say, like the TARDIS? You mean like Oscar's trash can? You mean like Snoopy's doghouse? All great examples of our understanding of dimensions being totally different. Yeah. Oh, I love it. Yeah. So that works. And that's essentially what they did inside the ship. Now we can't necessarily go into the science because we don't understand enough about how this quantum field in the Orville works, but they basically say we're going to create a warp bubble within the ship. The outside of the ship can flatten, but we'll still stay fine. Could that work? And I would say in theory, yes, although I would not argue that that's necessarily how an Alcubierre warp drive would behave. This is more like pushing... To use our own science fiction analogies, this is more like protruding into subspace to protect you from normal space. And if anyone wants to throw in some references from when we've actually successfully done that in Star Trek, I feel like that's been done before, or in another show. Star Trek tends to use subspace pretty consistently, so... but if they've ever escaped into subspace to protect themselves from what's going on in normal space, that's the analogy I would use rather than them creating a warp field from within their ship, because I don't think that necessarily would work. Yeah. Zed. Todd, that was probably one of the longest colloquialisms it took to break when I moved back to the States from Scotland was Zed. XYZ. That was like what I said. Okay, so as Dalian said, I think they got stuck in a warp bubble in an episode, but I don't remember which. Yeah, that is... Remember... Oh, the Prometheus, the phasing cloak. That might be it, actually. That works. Andrew, and then the Traveler going in and out of subspace. Yeah. I think that's probably more what I'm thinking of. So this idea that he could exist slightly in like a hyper dimension... I think that's probably the best analogy I would use for what they're doing here in the Orville. They're popping into a hyper-dimensional area in order to protect themselves from the Flatland there. A Darmok joke award. I love it. Yeah, so it's interesting. It's an interesting one. They do make it out. They experience nausea going in and out of this time bubble thingy. But it works. It's not terrible. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. What maybe you think that the inside of this vessel is doing. Or we could just keep making deep cut jokes, which I definitely appreciate it. So as Dalen says, yeah, if we curve into the fourth dimension via massive gravity, I don't see why we can't bubble ourselves in a higher space while being a sliver locally in this space. Yeah, that's exactly what I'm thinking of. And I think it would be more this idea that you protrude out into, in most sci-fi, subspace or hyperspace. To protect you what's going on from normal space. Okay, so another analogy, maybe that's why like the warp drive thing doesn't necessarily work, because you're encasing yourself within normal space to go faster than the speed of light. But let's think instead about, and I apologize. I don't apologize. In Star Wars, the hyperdrive, they never go into like how the hyperdrive works, but I have headcanoned it. And I'm happy with my explanation. And then in Thrawn 2 or Thrawn 3, they Timothy Zahn explains it in a very similar way. So in Star Wars, the hyperdrive essentially works by building a wormhole as they're traveling through. So that's I think more what we're doing here, that their engine, and they use superluminous particles, which are tachyons, in order to engage the hyperdrive to go in and build a warp bubble as they travel through normal space. So if you think about that, while they're in hyperspace, they're not existing in normal space, and they are protected and they are safe from whatever is going on down here. I think that works. I think so. Yeah, okay, in Generations, they try to create a subspace bubble around the Cool. That's the sort of thing I was thinking of, because I think they've done that too to try to preserve other planets or ships or something like that. So, yeah, I think that we're getting closer. I think that might be the closest one that we get there. Yeah, Andrew, this is absolutely right. That's why I wanted this to be, especially this one, much more of a discussion, because this idea of subdimensionality and hyperdimensionality is more philosophical than it necessarily is a scientific thing. Because we can talk about hyperdimensions, but we can't perceive them. And so with things like Flatland and these episodes, using that allegory to go down helps our brains try to think about what it's like to go up. And I think to great success. And I would say probably not pitting these against each other. I would say Futurama does it a little bit better when they talk about the looking down and us as the viewer. We talk about that fourth wall, right? Like from television, when you address the viewer, that they literally like treat the fourth wall like the third dimension in that episode and reference that. I think that pulls off better for our brains to try to conceptualize this better than we can, because we just can't visualize four dimensions. And even when I talk about space, when I talk about space-time, we talk about how that trampoline there's no going around it. We're talking about how that trampoline is really just a lower dimensional allegory for subspace, and then it's much more like you're sticking your hand into mattress springs, grabbing them and having all of it stretched towards each other. And then that moves around. That's a better three-dimensional representation of space-time than the trampoline. But the trampoline helps us visualize all those extra dynamics, like light curving around, how all the orbits work, how gravitational wells work. When you have this, stretching of springs in multiple directions, that's a lot harder to try to think about orbits and wells and all of that stuff, escape velocities. And so jumping through dimensions helps our brains understand difficult concepts, and but there's a limit to what we're able to conceptualize. So ooh, that's cool. What a fourth dimensional 3D shadow could represent out of space and time. I like that. Yeah, and that's too, I think, like what people who've tried to actually see if there's hyperdimensions, all of these sort of big astrophysical theories that, or even, quantum physics and particle physics and all of that, when they try to detect other dimensions, trying to think of ways that you would actually be able to do that and see those shadows. Like 2D, I like that. 2D map projections really screw up, and they screw up perspective too when you try to flatten 3D into 2D. It doesn't always work either. And then you have the shadows on top of that. What would a 4-dimensional shadow be in our 3-dimensional world? That's cool. It's weird to think about. So if you've followed me for a while, usually when we talk about 4 dimensions, we're usually talking about space and time. But in all of these, I mean the 4th spatial dimension there. Oh yeah, that works. Mind explodes. Exactly. Yeah, I love that. Yeah, the projection of a tesseract is a cube. And the projection of a cube is a square. The projection of a square is a line. So what would a 4th spatial dimension projection be? Yeah, it's interesting to think about. Fun, very philosophical. And if you, yeah, but a tesseract, but it's hard for us to see. Anyway, I'm kind of losing the plot. My brain is, my brain has been worked. Because it's really fun to think about. Yeah, it's always Cthulhu somewhere, for sure. That's fabulous. Yeah, so, thanks. Yeah, not too much science. I think it's too much philosophy. Because I function, and again, similarly, you can't have too much philosophy. These are the conversations I love. These are the conversations I miss. Oh, thank you, NC binary code. These are the types of conversations that I love having. This is why I go to conventions. This is why I interact with people online. This is why I'm streaming, because I love having these conversations, and to be on that border of philosophy and science is always really fascinating. I think the thing that I struggle with, and why I've lost the plot in the last couple minutes, is just because when we get to this level of understanding of dimensions and this stuff, my brain goes mathematical. And I know, like, a lot of other physicists and people, they struggle to explain basic science without the math at all. I'm lucky enough that I'm okay explaining physics without needing a lot of math behind that. But this is reaching that realm where my brain is like, but just do the math. It's in the equations. And it's fine. So it's really, yeah, it's fun to think about and conceptualize. And I really appreciate all of the discussions. I know there's no such thing whatsoever. It's why we're all here. It's why we're here, because we love it. And I gotta say, just to kind of to wrap up this, this episode, but I really love the concept of Flatland. Uncle Bill said at the beginning, it's one of those where we've seen so many homages to it that you almost forget, like, there is a story from, as we called out, 1884. Oh, thank you, Scriptorium. All right, for All Mankind, Apple series. I will have to subscribe to Apple, but I have heard this a lot. If you have a specific episode, you can whisper me or something, and we can coordinate that. Otherwise, we'll just do the first 2 episodes. I'll throw that on there. Thank you. Yeah, and see, they're great episodes from these shows when they use the Flatland. It's brilliant. Been having crazy thought experiments recently, trying to figure out or generalize why things have position or why things are not all one single 0 dimension point. Yeah, that was me falling into quantum field theory a couple days ago. I was just like, oh god, 0 point quantum fields. Why? What is this? And it's fun to think about. So it's good. Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you. Added. And, yeah. All right, and we got a good suggestion from Scriptorium, so thank you for All Mankind. We'll look that up. We'll add that to the voting roster. And with that, we are at the top of the hour, so thank you. If it's your first time here, this is our weekly episode club where we talk about the science behind science fiction movies and TV shows suggested by our patrons, and now people in the chat can redeem channel points for that. This is our new test thing that we're doing in Scriptorium. Thank you for adding one. And then on Fridays, I talk about, I teach Astronomy 101. Just straight up Astronomy 101, and then we do like a just chatting discussion after the lecture on that one. On Sundays, I do a Star Trek brunch where we just, physics, science aside, it's a talk show thing I do with a friend of mine who's never watched Star Trek, so she's seen a lot now. I can't, but she's a first-time viewer of these episodes, so we discuss those, and it's super fun. And then on Mondays, we play Mass Effect, as we do. So, all right, did I miss anything else in this chat? And yes, come here for physics chat. This is fun. I appreciate it. And you can find my links down below to my YouTube channel and all that fun stuff. So, VirtualCon, you can see me next at. I think my next one. So, I am going to be a speaker at the St. Louis Science Center. Their first Friday's events. I'm giving my physics and Star Trek talk, so you can check that out. I'll put a link to my on my Twitter to that. And then after that, I will be doing Fort Collins Comic-Con the last weekend of August. I actually might have something really fun planned for that. I'm hoping we can make it work, but stay tuned for that. That's Fort Collins Comic-Con. And I am a guest alongside Maurice LaMarche and Rob Paulson, otherwise known as Pinky and the Brain. And I love those guys. So I'm like honored to see my name even in their proximity. I met Maurice LaMarche once and he's just the kindest human and I love him and it's fabulous. Oh, thank you, Corvusy. And then, and then Dragon Con, virtual Dragon Con. We're still putting stuff together, so no promises on that. I might make the cut, I might not, but if I do, I will let people know. And Scriptorium, oh yeah, Leonard Nimoy, we love him. And that's a great way to end it. So with that, thank you all for spending a little bit of time with me. Get up, stand, stretch, grab some water, take care of yourselves and each other. We'll be here again soon. I may actually do a watch party tomorrow or Thursday. Watch the pilot of Deep Space Nine live on Twitch. Why not? If anyone wants to join, I'll post if I decide to do that or not, just depending on how the week goes. But otherwise, thank you again for being here. Thanks to the mods and all of the new follows, and I really appreciate it. So I will catch you all again soon. Let me see if there's anyone going on we can hop over to. If anyone has suggestions for a raid, if there's any science people on, otherwise, I can just let it go here. So no worries, Planetary. That's all right. That's what streaming services are for. Otherwise, we'll just end it. So with that, thank you all for hanging out, and I really appreciate all of your time. I'll see you again next time. All right. Bye, everyone.